So my name is Clayton Tino. I'm the Chief Technology Officer for a company called Beep. For the talk this morning, I'm going to talk a little bit about who Beep is and what we do. Before skipping to the punch, we're essentially a mobility as a service provider located, I'm actually in Lake Nona, so just down the street by the airport. I'm going to talk about not specifically mobility as a service, but actually what it's like and pardon me for using cliche, but where the rubber meets the road in terms of putting a mobility service kind of in production or actually on the streets today with normal passenger vehicles in a public setting. Lastly, I'm going to give you a little bit of a kind of anecdotes on kind of my experience coming into this space. I'm recently new to the company. I've been here about 4 months. Before that, I worked in a very different industry. And it's been an eye-opening experience to look at how these vehicles behave and how they react on the public streets and how other vehicles around them behave. So I gave a little bit of anecdote, talk about some of the things we've learned implementing a service in Lake Nona. And then lastly, again, you're all invited to join us on an actual ride of one of our shuttles over in that installation. So I hope you join us with that as well. So who is Beep? Beep is a controlled speed electric fixed route, multi-passenger autonomous mobility as a service solutions provider. That's saying quite a bit. It's a little bit of a mouthful to get out there, but it really sets the context for the space that we're in specifically with respect to autonomy and autonomous vehicles. If you look at the market today, there are kind of really two large trends. There's the kind of Waymos, Teslas, Ubers of the world going after the robo-taxi market, specifically looking at high-speed, on-demand mobility. There's also a very different portion of the industry primarily looking at fixed route, low speed, more people mover use cases. And that's really what we're able to get on the roads today, and I'll talk about that in a second why. I'm going to talk a little bit about kind of just the fact that we're based on our leadership team in general comes from typically a mix of fleet management and technology entrepreneurs. I call that out specifically because we take a very different approach to how we approach mobility as a service. We're less focused on the actual technology platforms themselves. I'm not building an autonomous vehicle. I'm not geeking out, for lack of a better way of putting it, over the vehicle itself. We're approaching the industry in use cases and actually the market in general from a use case-driven perspective. How can we enable mobility as a service for our constituents, be it private sector developers looking to add a mobility service to a development group they might have deployed, versus maybe a state or city agency looking to increase traffic throughput through a certain corridor in a major congested city area. Point being, we're looking to bring AV technologies to bear to solve these problems in the world today, not necessarily manufacture a vehicle that's going to be on the road in 15 years. As a bit of a side note, we also just happen to be, and this is more trivia than anything, the first distributor for autonomous vehicles in the US. I'll talk about the regulatory challenges in the market today and why that's an issue, and why you're not seeing more US manufactured vehicles on the road today, but that's just a good bit of trivia to kind of set up the talk. So if we look through kind of the problem areas by constituent, and this is really kind of how we frame our view of the market, we have kind of three really big pillars here in terms of actually implementing a mobility service. We've heard quite a bit about the opportunities from a ridership perspective, right? We've talked about the cost dynamics of how expensive it is in general for transportation services today, and also the opportunities involved in ridership and what can be gained, whether it's congestion, carbon footprint reductions, safety. There are a lot of use cases there. I would have to say that this is not my slide, but I fit the millennial mindset to a T. Unfortunately, I can be cast that way. I live in Atlanta. I live in a city center. I don't live outside Atlanta. I actually live in Midtown. I'm one of the few people who can say I'm from the city when you talk to them. I drive a car because I have to, not because I necessarily want to. I essentially want to go where I want to go, when I want to go there, and I don't want to pay a lot to do it. I'm very needy that way. But there's obviously a great opportunity in the mass space in general, which is kind of the nirvana we're trying to reach. How can I get where I want to go without having to spend an arm and a leg to do that? And the next bit, I think, is also the access to essential services. We've talked about underserved passengers or underserved riders. There's a huge opportunity in the space of the elderly or the handicapped or disabled, people who don't traditionally have access to transportation. One of the things we see specifically in Atlanta is socioeconomic impact. We see a big urbanization of city centers and people moving back to the city. And one of the largest challenges to people taking benefit of this actually renewal is access to actually get to the city center itself, being able to transport themselves in because either of a lack of a vehicle or a lack of available transportation. I think we're all aware of the benefits to be gained from mobility as a service. A few of the problem areas that we have really are around primarily the AV ecosystem at the moment. It's a very fragmented supplier group. Again, there are thousands of different autonomy vehicles, whether or not you're a supplier of autonomous system or an actual vehicle integrator. And I believe we're going to talk a little bit about the challenges in that space here in a second to making sure we have safe systems deployed there. I could probably point to just a handful of vehicles that are manufactured today that I would actually feel comfortable putting on the roadway. Probably less than 5, frankly, in terms of that multi-passenger kind of people mover shuttle space. The fun thing about that, too, is that they all behave extremely differently. I'll talk about this in a second and kind of my anecdotes on our service observations to this point. But a Navia shuttle behaves very differently than a Best Mile shuttle, than an Easy Mile shuttle, than one of the Teltec shuttles. There are a wide variety of opportunities and options as you enter the space to actually implement a mobility service, but there's a lot of learnings required to kind of blend some of those edges for how you bring these technologies to bear. One of the drivers for that and one of the other challenges we're seeing is the fact that, again, because of that fragmented space, there's no benefit to economies of scale, right? If you look at the Fords of the world or kind of your big three in the US or your major VW or BMW groups in Europe, there's very little interest for those manufacturers to get in that space, and that drives another challenge, which I'll talk about in a second, which is the cost point. One of the huge issues we're seeing primarily in the autonomy space is the fact that it's just not it's cost prohibitive today to implement these kind of services with autonomous vehicles. If you look at a majority of the sensor packages on these cars, for example, you've got the Teslas in the world chasing camera vision systems, frankly, because of a lower cost point, but that technology is not as mature, so it's going to take a longer time to market. You're seeing more of the multi-passenger space looking at traditional LiDAR systems. They perform a little bit better. It's more established from a control systems perspective. At the same time, they're incredibly expensive. So we have an interplay between a variety of manufacturers bringing somewhat expensive technologies to market, and those are really kind of the two key impediments we have to really seeing this proliferate a little bit more broadly. One of the other interesting challenges is, frankly, government regulations. If you look at most of the mobility as a service solutions today in the U.S., primarily in the multi-passenger and kind of public road space, part of the challenges we have is there's no standard process to actually implement these kind of services in the U.S. We have an amazing partnership with the National Highway Transportation Safety Administration. They've been a big partner of ours through the past 6 months to get the service stood up in Lake Nona. But there's no standardized process for how I say, as a fleet provider or a service or a mobility provider, I want to buy an autonomous vehicle, I want to operate a service in this area. There's no forms to fill out, there's not a standard process for that. It's a very detailed per route, per implementation specific process to having any sort of clearance into getting these vehicles on public roadways. Very simple to do on private roads. It's a little bit, the red tape's a little bit less cumbersome there, but at the same time, that's not really how we unlock true mass and how we unlock kind of all of these wealth of use cases we've spoken about. Because of that, our live test opportunities for innovations are fairly limited. We know exactly how these vehicles behave in closed environments. We know how we can model the safety of those systems. We're going to hear more about that. But we don't have a lot of real road miles in terms of how you can vet out and improve these systems based on the regulatory stance of the U.S. government at this point in time. So think about a situation where we have an untapped world of opportunity in terms of the benefits to be gained by true mobility. We have a technology market that's extremely fractured in terms of the behavior and the make and model and how these vehicles behave essentially on the roadway. We have a regulatory environment that's not necessarily conducive to seeing these sorts of services come to market. And now we have the last challenge, which is, frankly, how do we unlock the benefit to the community? Whether or not you're a public sector agency, either a municipality or a city, or maybe you're a state DOT looking to gain some of the benefits, or you're a private developer looking to implement a mobility service, we now have a challenge where we have prohibitively expensive vehicles and a lot of regulatory red tape standing in your way of unlocking these true potential. So a lot of what we do from a mobility service provider perspective is how do we make the business case for these services? How can we take technology that may be hard to implement, that may be expensive, that may seem like it's not necessarily ready for prime time, and make the business case for ensuring that whether or not it's a municipality trying to unlock transportation for underserved communities, or maybe a college or university trying to improve the bus system on the local campus to improve perspective on their ridership from a student perspective. A majority of the focus in actually getting these services in market today is how can you make that case given the landscape today from a regulatory and technology perspective. I think I lost my clicker. There we go. So a few anecdotes about what we've learned throughout this process, trying to untangle the technology challenges, trying to untangle the regulatory challenges. We've been in operations in Lake Nona just over 4 months now. We run a single route at this point, expanding next month to a few more routes between two primary areas of that property, town center and then the actual Laureate Park area. So it's a 1.2 mile route that connects both sides of the property there in Lake Nona. The first 4 months, we've had 10,000 riders. I was personally surprised, being new to the company, how much the community is latched onto the service, how much they enjoy being a part of it and getting to ride it. I think the best way to kind of describe this is to give you kind of my first day on the job. So I joined the company in October. I flew down to Orlando, and like most first days on the job, everyone you're supposed to meet with is unavailable because something came up. So I'm sitting in a new office. I don't know anyone, so I thought, well, heck, I'm the CTO. I might as well go ride the shuttle and see what this is all about. So I walk down to the shuttle, doors open, and I'm actually greeted by someone. I'm a technology-leaning guy. I'm young, and I like to think I'm up on kind of what's going on in the industry. I was surprised to see someone on the shuttle. I'm like, well, I thought this was an autonomous vehicle. Why is there someone saying hello to me when I get on board? I strap in, we start to pull out of the stop, and we start along the route connecting the two parts of the property. So I'm sitting in the shuttle, and we're actually moving along at a pretty good pace. I'm like, all right, this is new, it's exciting. I'm getting a little bit more intrigued by what's going on, and I turn to look out to the side of the window, and I notice that we're being outpaced by a jogger. And I have this period of existential crisis in my head where I'm like, I'm in a car. It seems like I'm moving fairly quickly, and this person's running past me. While I'm trying to work this out in my head, bam, slam on the brakes. So my first reaction is pure panic. Like, great, I got this job, I'm at this new company, we've hit somebody, like the shuttle's coming to a hard stop, I have no idea what's going on. Thankfully, the safety attendant or the shuttle operator on board explained to me kind of in short order, don't worry, this happens occasionally. What we're essentially seeing is because we travel at a lower rate of speed than the cars behind us, we occasionally have people that get a little impatient and they want to pass us on a double yellow. It just so happens to be, and I learned this about a month later, that based on that particular shuttle platform, if a vehicle overtakes the car just a little bit too close, it senses an obstacle and it slams on the brakes. It's actually a safety feature. Everything was behaving exactly as it should have. The point of telling this anecdote is it really validated a few things for me. Number one, we found extreme value in actually having that person on board, regardless of whether or not you are a technophile, you like to be up on the new technology, because the vehicles don't talk to you and they don't tell you what's happening. Even if you're comfortable with the idea of riding an autonomous vehicle, it's good to have that reinforcement that everything's okay and to explain to you what's happening. We like to draw a parallel to the old elevator attendants back at the turn of the 19th century. You didn't actually need someone on board to push the button for you. You needed someone on board to explain to you that it's not a death trap and to make you feel comfortable about it. I think as we see these types of technologies proliferate, the value of having that human touch, which also happens to be a regulatory requirement, I should say that, we found tremendous benefit of being able to have that person be kind of the steward for people riding on our service and on our shuttles, especially with people that may be predisposed to not riding on these sorts of vehicles. So we talked about underserved communities. My grandparents aren't going to step on an autonomous vehicle unless I convince them. So we've seen having these ambassadors for the community provide real value in terms of how we make people comfortable with technology and how we start to increase our ridership from that perspective as well. The other aspect we learned, and I talked quite a bit about the challenges in all of these different vehicle platforms, how they behave, how you plan a route. One of the key learnings we have is it's less about the vehicle itself and more about how that vehicle interacts with other people. We've learned quite a bit in terms of how other drivers expect vehicles to behave on the roadway. You get to a four-way stop and everybody's familiar with that hesitation of who's going to go next. Humans innately have a very strong ability to sense hesitation and intent. Autonomous vehicles today don't have that. So one of the key learnings we have as we look at unlocking new use cases and new routes and new mobility capabilities is the fact that the human factors involvement is huge. And it's not just the vehicle control system itself, but it's how you plan, how you implement service, and how you account for how other vehicles and how other pedestrians or vulnerable road users might react with your service on the roadway. So again, fractured community, fractured technology base, which again I think is solvable. Some regulatory challenges, but we've noticed that as you actually get into it, we've got an extremely positive feedback from the community in terms of having the service available, in terms of the ability for that community to be able to take advantage of this without having to wait for an Uber, which is one of the challenges we have specifically in that area in terms of where it's located. And we're also seeing an increase in people's willingness to kind of engage and look for the expansion of this service. So it's been a good program to be part of. That said, I know we all have an opportunity to join us, and if you'd like to ride on the shuttle, we'll have that available for you after the talk today. So I hope you join us for that experience. If not, more than welcome to answer any questions after the panel as well. So thank you very much.